Lightning split the void above Cadia's remains, but this was no ordinary storm. Reality itself convulsed as something impossibly ancient tore through the barriers between dimensions. The Immaterium screamed in languages that predated human speech, and across 1,000 worlds, astropaths collapsed, bleeding from their eyes, as visions of divine fury burned through their consciousness. What emerged from that cosmic wound defied every law the Mechanicus had catalogued. A figure of impossible majesty descended through the wreckage of the 13th Black Crusade, his form crackling with energies that made even the Eye of Terror seem dim by comparison. This was no Daemon Prince ascending from the warp's depths. This was something far older, far more terrible in its perfect authority. Zeus, king of Olympus, lord of the sky, had arrived in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. His first breath in this new reality sent shock waves rippling across space itself. Where his feet touched the blasted earth of what had once been humanity's most stalwart fortress world, the very atoms rearranged themselves in recognition of his divine presence. The tainted soil purged itself of chaos, corruption, not through cleansing fire or sacred ritual, but through the simple fact that nothing impure could exist in proximity to genuine godhood. The surviving imperial forces on the planet's surface stared upward in stunned silence. Veterans who had witnessed the fall of Saint Celestine, who had seen living saints manifest their divine power, fell to their knees at the sight of something that transcended even those miraculous displays. This being radiated authority that made even the God Emperor's distant psychic presence seem muted by comparison. Lord Commander Dante, ancient beyond measure even by Astartes standards, felt something he had not experienced in over a millennium of warfare: fear. Not the rational concern of a tactical mind assessing threats, but the primal terror of a mortal creature recognizing its absolute insignificance before true divinity. His enhanced physiology, designed to know no weakness, trembled as divine power washed over him in waves. Zeus surveyed this strange new realm with eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. The architecture of human habitation stretched before him, but it was wrong somehow. Where were the temples dedicated to proper worship? Where were the shrines acknowledging the natural order of divine hierarchy? Instead, he saw monuments to a single figure, a being these mortals called their God Emperor. The king of Olympus had encountered usurpers before, titans who had challenged the rightful order, mortals who had forgotten their place. But this was different. This entire galaxy seemed to revolve around the worship of one individual, and the psychic resonance of that faith created a background hum that set his divine essence on edge. In the warp, entities that had existed since the galaxy's youth suddenly found their attention drawn to this newcomer. The Chaos Gods, those parasitic reflections of mortal emotion, turned their multifaceted awareness toward the anomaly. Here was something that existed outside their understanding, a being whose power derived not from the collective unconscious of mortal minds, but from sources far more ancient and fundamental. Khorne, the blood god, felt the divine warrior's presence like a challenge carved in lightning across reality's face. Here was a deity of war and kingship, concepts that fell squarely within his domain. Yet this Zeus emanated authority without the mindless rage that fed the skull throne. Power without corruption, strength without the endless hunger for slaughter that defined all proper warfare. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, found his vast intelligence struggling to calculate probabilities around this new variable. Every strand of fate that touched this being simply terminated, as if destiny itself acknowledged some higher authority. The architect of fate had never encountered something so fundamentally resistant to manipulation and change. Nergal, grandfather of plagues, recoiled as his gifts of entropy and decay withered in proximity to this divine presence. Here was life in its most perfect form, unchanging and eternal, neither growing nor decaying but simply existing in perpetual divine perfection. It was an affront to the natural cycle of death and rebirth that formed his very essence. Slaanesh, the dark prince of excess, felt something approaching genuine curiosity. Here was a being of such perfect beauty and terrible power that even the Prince of Pleasure found themselves momentarily subdued. Yet this Zeus showed none of the weakness, none of the hunger for sensation and experience that made mortals such delightful playthings. On Terra, deep within the golden throne sanctum, the Emperor's withered form stirred with something approaching alarm. Through 10,000 years of science, he had never encountered a presensic vigil like this. The being that had just manifested possessed power that rivaled his own, but came from sources entirely outside his understanding. More troubling still, this entity's very existence seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions upon which the imperial faith was built. The Custodes felt it first, their psychic sensitivity attuned to their master's condition after millennia of vigil. The Emperor's psychic presence, normally rock-steady in its terrible constancy, fluctuated with something that might have been uncertainty. Captain General Trajan Valoris found himself doing something he had never done in 3 centuries of service. He questioned whether the Emperor truly was the supreme divine authority he had always believed him to be. Across the galaxy, the effects rippled outward in ways both subtle and profound. On shrine worlds, statues of the Emperor began to crack, not from any external force, but from some fundamental shift in the nature of faith itself. Ecclesiarchy priests found their sermons faltering as words of absolute devotion suddenly rang hollow in their mouths. The very concept of the god Emperor's unquestionable supremacy was being challenged by the simple fact of Zeus's existence. In the maelstrom, Huron Blackheart felt his cybernetic implants spark as divine electricity danced through local space. The Red Corsair had trafficked with powers beyond mortal comprehension for centuries, but this was different. This was not the seductive whisper of chaos promising power in exchange for corruption. This was authority so absolute that even his enhanced transhuman pride bent before it. Space Marine chapters across the galaxy found their battle brothers experiencing unprecedented phenomena. Chaplains reported that their spiritual guidance felt inadequate when measured against this new presence. Librarians discovered their psychic abilities fluctuating wildly, as if the very nature of the warp had been fundamentally altered by this newcomer's arrival. The Mechanicus faced perhaps the greatest crisis of faith since the discovery of the standard template constructs. Their doctrine preached that the Emperor was the Omnissiah, the living embodiment of divine knowledge and technological perfection. But their instruments detected energy signatures from this Zeus that exceeded even theoretical maximums for psychic potential. How could their calculations be wrong? How could their faith be incomplete? On Forge worlds throughout the galaxy, tech priests found themselves questioning axioms that had guided their brotherhood for 10 millennia. If the Emperor was not the ultimate expression of divine authority, then what did that mean for their understanding of the machine spirit? What did it mean for their quest to comprehend the Omnissiah's will? But it was among the common citizens of the Imperium that the most profound changes began to manifest. On hive worlds where billions toiled in darkness, people began to dream of open skies and distant mountains. Visions of a golden figure wreathed in lightning filled their sleep, offering not the distant, terrible love of the god Emperor, but something more immediate and comprehensible. A god who walked among mortals, rather than ruling from a throne of bones and machinery. These were not the seductive promises of chaos, which always came with a price written in corruption and madness. This was something cleaner, more honest. Divine authority that demanded respect but offered protection in return. A natural hierarchy that elevated rather than crushed those beneath it. In the underhives of Necromunda, gang warfare suddenly seemed petty and meaningless as hardened criminals found themselves overcome with visions of proper order. On agri-worlds, farmers looked up from their toil to see storm clouds gathering in patterns that spoke of divine attention. Even in the depths of space, voidsmen aboard imperial vessels felt the change as something fundamental shifted in the galaxy's spiritual architecture. Zeus himself remained unaware of these rippling effects as he took his first steps across the surface of ruined Cadia. His attention was focused on understanding this strange new realm into which he had been cast. The architecture was familiar enough, the basic patterns of mortal civilization recognizable despite their Gothic elaboration, but the spiritual landscape was utterly alien. Where were the proper shrines? Where were the temples dedicated to the natural pantheon of divine authority? Instead, he saw only endless repetition of a single symbol, a double-headed eagle that seemed to represent this god-emperor figure. It was as if an entire galaxy had forgotten fundamental, the truth that divinity was diverse, that different aspects of existence required different divine oversight. The king of Olympus had always understood himself as first among equals, the mightiest of the gods, but still part of a larger divine order. Poseidon ruled the seas, Hades governed the underworld, Athena presided over wisdom and warfare's strategic aspects. Each had their domain, their responsibility, their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. But this Imperium seemed to recognize only one divine authority, and that authority was notably absent from the battlefield where Zeus now stood. If this god-emperor truly possessed the power his worshippers attributed to him, why had he not prevented the corruption and devastation that scarred this world? Why had he allowed his followers to suffer such catastrophic defeat? These questions would demand answers, and Zeus had never been patient with mysteries that touched upon divine prerogative and responsibility. The storm clouds gathering overhead began to take on distinctly unnatural patterns as the king of Olympus prepared to announce his presence to this strange new galaxy. The announcement came not through words, but through divine action that rewrote the fundamental laws governing local reality. Zeus raised his hand, and the storm clouds above Cadia's broken surface began to spiral into formations that had never been witnessed in this galaxy. Lightning descended not in random strikes, but in perfectly controlled bolts that carved symbols into the earth itself. Ancient Greek letters spelling out declarations of divine authority in a language that predated humanity's exodus from old Earth by millennia. The first imperial forces to approach did so with weapons drawn and prayers on their lips. A squad of Cadian shock troopers, survivors of the planet's final battle, advanced through the rubble with their lasguns trained on the figure who stood at the epicenter of this impossible storm. Their sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Corin, had survived 3 Black Crusades and thought he understood the nature of threats that could manifest in real space. He was catastrophically wrong. Zeus turned his attention to these approaching mortals, and the very air around them began to shimmer with barely contained power. The soldiers' weapons simply ceased to function, not through any mechanical failure but through the simple fact that their crude energy cells could not maintain coherence in proximity to such overwhelming divine presence. Their enhanced combat gear, blessed by tech priests and sanctified against the corruption of chaos, became inert metal and ceramite in the face of authority that transcended all such protections. Sergeant Corin found himself unable to maintain his aggressive stance as waves of divine majesty washed over him. This was not the distant, terrible presence of the God-Emperor that pressed against mortal minds during moments of extreme faith. This was immediate, personal, and utterly undeniable. He dropped to one knee without conscious decision, his enhanced soldier's conditioning overwhelmed by instincts far older than imperial doctrine. The king of Olympus studied these mortals with growing fascination. Their equipment was crude but functional, their discipline evident despite their obvious terror. More interesting was their spiritual resonance, the way their souls carried the psychic imprint of absolute devotion to their absent deity. It was impressive in its intensity but troubling in its singular focus. These warriors had been conditioned to recognize only one form of divine authority, and that conditioning was creating cognitive dissonance as they struggled to process what they were experiencing. Zeus spoke, and his voice carried across the battlefield with perfect clarity despite the howling winds of the unnatural storm. The language he used was archaic Greek, but somehow every listener understood his words as if they had been spoken in their native tongue. This was not translation but true communication, divine meaning impressed directly upon mortal consciousness. I am Zeus, son of Kronos, king of Olympus, and lord of the sky. I have come to this realm seeking understanding of the order that governs here. Tell me of this god-emperor whose symbols cover every surface, whose name fills every prayer. Tell me why he permits such suffering among those who worship him with such devotion. The words struck the assembled soldiers like physical blows. Several collapsed entirely, their minds unable to process the implications of what they were hearing. Others began to weep uncontrollably as fundamental certainties about the nature of divinity crumbled around them. Sergeant Corin, drawing upon reserves of strength he did not know he possessed, managed to remain conscious and coherent enough to respond. The God-Emperor protects, he whispered. the rote phrase emerging automatically from lips that trembled with religious terror. He is our shield against the darkness, our light in the void. He guides us from the golden throne on holy terror, where he has watched over humanity for 10,000 years. Zeus listened to this response with growing displeasure. The mortal spoke of protection and guidance, but where was the evidence of such divine intervention? This world lay in ruins, its people slaughtered or corrupted, its defenses shattered by forces that any competent deity should have been able to repel with ease. Either this god-emperor was far weaker than his followers believed, or he had chosen to abandon them in their hour of greatest need. Neither possibility reflected well on the supposed divine authority governing this galaxy. The king of Olympus extended his awareness outward, sampling the psychic resonances that permeated local space. What he discovered filled him with a mixture of fascination and disgust. The warp, as the locals called it, was indeed a realm of spiritual energy, but it had been so thoroughly corrupted by millennia of mortal suffering that it bore little resemblance to the clean divine hierarchy he remembered from his own reality. Worse still, the entities that ruled in that twisted dimension were not gods in any proper sense, but parasitic reflections of mortal emotion. They fed upon the very suffering they created, growing stronger through the perpetuation of the cycle of violence and despair that defined this galaxy's existence. It was a fundamentally broken system, one that could only exist in the absence of proper divine oversight. Zeus had encountered similar situations before, during the early days of his reign when the Titans had sought to maintain their chaotic dominion over creation. The solution then had been direct intervention, the establishment of clear divine authority backed by overwhelming power. Perhaps the same approach would serve here. But first, he needed to understand the true nature of this absent god-emperor. The answer came sooner than expected, manifesting not through direct communication, but through the arrival of forces that carried his psychic imprint. A strike cruiser of the Grey Knights translated into real space above the ruined world, its blessed hull gleaming with protective wards and sacred inscriptions. Aboard that vessel were warriors whose entire existence was dedicated to combating the influence of chaos, soldiers whose faith in the Emperor was so absolute that it provided tangible protection against corruption. Grand Master Voldus led the strike force that descended to the planet's surface, his nemesis force sword humming with psychic energy as he approached the epicenter of the disturbance. The Grey Knights were the Emperor's most elite servants, warriors whose minds were shielded against any form of supernatural influence. If anyone could resist the presence that had manifested on Cadia, it would be these incorruptible champions. They lasted approximately 30 seconds before their psychic defenses began to crack. Voldus himself managed to maintain coherence longer than his battle brothers, his centuries of experience with entities of immense power providing some measure of protection. But even he found his absolute faith in the Emperor's supremacy wavering as he approached the figure who stood calmly in the center of a storm that rewrote the laws of physics with casual ease. Zeus regarded these new arrivals with increased interest. Their equipment was more sophisticated than the common soldiers, their spiritual resonance more refined and focused. More significantly, they carried weapons and armor that had been specifically designed to combat supernatural entities. It suggested that this god-emperor, whatever his limitations, at least understood the nature of the threats his followers faced. The Grey Knights attempted to establish a combat formation, their training and experience guiding them, even as their enhanced minds struggled to process what they were encountering. Grand Master Voldus raised his force sword, its blade crackling with energies drawn from the Emperor's own psychic presence channeled through 10,000 years of sacred ritual. Zeus gestured dismissively, and the weapon simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged, but unmade at the fundamental level as divine authority reasserted proper order over the crude manipulation of spiritual energy. The Grand Master stared at his empty gauntlets in shock, his worldview cracking as thoroughly as his weapon had been dissolved. "Your Emperor is not here," Zeus observed, his tone carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "He sends servants to face what he lacks the courage to confront personally. In my realm, such cowardice would be grounds for immediate replacement in the divine hierarchy." The blasphemy of these words struck the cool Grey Knights like physical blows, but not deny the evidence of their senses. This being had casually dismissed their most sacred weapons, had neutralized their psychic defenses, had made their enhanced transhuman physiology irrelevant through the simple application of overwhelming divine authority. Grand Master Voldus struggled to formulate a response, his centuries of training and experience providing no framework for this situation. The Grey Knights had been created to combat the influence of chaos, to stand against entities that sought to corrupt and destroy the natural order. But this Zeus seemed to represent something else entirely, a form of divine authority that predated and transcended the familiar categories of imperial theology. The King of Olympus, the Fallen, studies warriors with something approaching sympathy. They were not evil, merely misguided by a flawed understanding of divine hierarchy. Their devotion was genuine, their courage undeniable. They had been shaped by a system that recognized only one form of godhood and thus left them defenseless against alternatives. "Rise," he commanded, and the Grey Knights found themselves obeying despite their conscious will to resist. Divine authority flowed through the simple word, making disobedience not just difficult, but conceptually impossible. "You serve a master who rules through absence and fear. I offer you the chance to serve one who leads through presence and strength." The implications of this offer sent shock waves through the assembled warriors that went far beyond the merely tactical. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had been built on the unshakable foundation of the Emperor's divine authority. Every institution, every tradition, every article of faith depended upon the absolute certainty that he was the one true God of humanity. But now that certainty was crumbling, and with it, the entire structure of imperial civilization began to show signs of stress that would soon manifest across the galaxy in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The first cracks in the Imperium's foundation manifested not through grand declarations or cosmic battles, but through the quiet doubts that began to spread like a virus through the minds of the faithful. On distant worlds where imperial doctrine had remained unquestioned for millennia, priests found their morning prayers catching in their throats as visions of lightning-wreathed divinity intruded upon their meditations. Brother Captain Artemis of the Ultramarines felt the change first as a subtle wrongness in the psychic resonance of his battle brothers. The chapter's librarians reported unusual dreams, visions of ancient Greece that none of them had ever studied yet somehow recognized with perfect clarity. Mount Olympus rose in their sleeping minds, its peaks crowned with palaces that made even the most magnificent imperial architecture seem crude by comparison. The phenomenon spread beyond the Adeptus Astartes with terrifying speed. On the forge world of Lucius, Tech Dominus Xerion discovered that his most sacred calculations were producing impossible results. The mathematical constants that governed warp travel, the fundamental equations underlying the Omnissiah's blessed technology, had somehow been altered by forces beyond comprehension. Where once there had been singular divine authority governing the machine spirits, now there was interference from something older and more primal. Zeus himself remained focused on the immediate situation, his divine senses probing the spiritual architecture of this strange galaxy. The Grey Knights before him represented the pinnacle of this Imperium's understanding of divine service, yet their training was fundamentally flawed. They had been conditioned to resist corruption and chaos, but not to recognize legitimate divine authority when it manifested outside their narrow theological framework. Grand Master Voldus struggled to maintain his composure as reality continued to reshape itself around the Olympian deity. His psychic hood, blessed by the Emperor himself, and inscribed with wards that had protected him through centuries of combat against the galaxy's worst horrors, felt suddenly inadequate. The protective prayers that had always provided comfort now seemed hollow, their familiar words unable to bridge the gap between imperial doctrine and the overwhelming presence before him. "Your weapons are crude," Zeus observed, gesturing toward the Grey Knight's deactivated equipment. "Your understanding of divine hierarchy is flawed. But your devotion is genuine, and that has value. Tell me, warrior, does your Emperor speak to you directly? Does he walk among his followers and share in their struggles?" The question struck at the heart of imperial theology with surgical precision. For 10,000 years, the God Emperor's silence had been explained as divine transcendence, his absence justified as necessary sacrifice for humanity's protection. But faced with a deity who manifested in person, who spoke directly to mortals, and who demonstrated immediate divine intervention, Those explanations began to sound like desperate rationalizations. Voldus found himself answering despite his training. The Emperor protects us through his eternal vigilance. He guides the Astronomicon, shields us from the worst excesses of the warp, and maintains the barriers that prevent chaos from consuming all reality. His sacrifice is absolute, his dedication unquestionable. Zeus listened to this response with growing skepticism. The mortal spoke of protection and guidance, but the evidence suggested something far different. This galaxy was awash in suffering, its populations ground down by endless war and oppression. If this God-Emperor possessed genuine divine power, why had he chosen to remain passive while his followers endured such torment? The King of Olympus had never been one to rule from a distance. Divine authority, in his understanding, required personal involvement. A god who remained hidden while his worshippers suffered was either powerless or indifferent, neither of which reflected well on his fitness to rule. "Show me," Zeus commanded, his voice carrying undertones that made the air itself tremble with potential energy. "Show me this golden throne where your emperor maintains his eternal watch. Show me the source of his power and the nature of his sacrifice." The demand sent waves of panic through the imperial forces present. To approach the Golden Throne was forbidden to all but the highest ranks of the Adeptus Custodes. Even the Grey Knights, for all their sacred authority, had never been granted such access. The very suggestion bordered on heresy of the highest order. But Zeus was not making a request. Divine will pressed against the assembled mortals, making resistance not just difficult but fundamentally impossible. Grand Master Voldus found himself activating his Voxcaster, transmitting coordinates and authentication codes that would grant passage to the Sol system. The words emerged from his lips without conscious volition, compelled by authority that transcended all human hierarchy. Above Cadia's shattered surface, reality began to warp as Zeus prepared for translocation across the galaxy. The storm clouds that had marked his arrival started to coalesce into patterns that hurt mortal eyes to perceive directly. Lightning danced between dimensions, creating temporary bridges through space-time that bypassed the conventional limitations of warp travel. The effect was noticed immediately by every astropath in the segmentum. Across dozens of sectors, Imperial psychers collapsed in agony as their minds were flooded with visions of divine transportation. The very concept of distance seemed to become optional as Zeus demonstrated power that made even the most advanced imperial technology appear primitive. On Terra itself, the effects were catastrophic. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon that had guided human navigation for 10 millennia, flickered as competing sources of divine energy interfered with its carefully maintained resonance. Navigator houses across the galaxy found their warp site disrupted by something that existed outside all conventional understanding of psychic phenomena. In the depths of the imperial palace, the Custodes felt their emperor's psychic presence fluctuate with what could only be described as alarm. Captain General Trajan Valoris had served at the emperor's side for centuries, had witnessed the full scope of his master's terrible power, but this was something unprecedented. Another deity was approaching Terra, and the God Emperor's response suggested genuine uncertainty about the outcome of such a confrontation. High Lord Fabricator General Ududi Araskian found her most sophisticated augury systems failing to provide coherent readings. The approaching entity defied every category of threat assessment, every protocol for dealing with hostile manifestations. This was not chaos corruption, not Xenos infiltration, not even the return of a lost Primarch. This was something entirely outside the Imperium's experience, a form of divine authority that predated their civilization by millions of years. Zeus materialized not in the throne room itself, but in the outer precincts of the imperial palace. Even his overwhelming power recognized the need for proper protocol when approaching another deity's seat of authority. The golden corridors stretched before him, their impossible scale and baroque decoration speaking to the grandiose vision of whoever had designed this monument to imperial power. The Custodes responded with the fluid precision of warriors who had trained for this moment across millennia, though none of them had ever imagined facing a threat of this particular nature. Captain General Valoris led the response personally, his guardian spear crackling with energies drawn from the Emperor's own divine essence. Behind him marched the 10,000, each warrior a masterpiece of genetic engineering and martial training. They formed a living wall of gold and ceramite between Zeus and the approach to the throne room, their weapons raised in perfect unison. These were not the crude soldiers who had first encountered the Olympian deity on Cadia's surface. These were the Emperor's personal guard, warriors whose faith was so absolute that it provided tangible protection against supernatural influence. Zeus regarded them with something approaching respect. Finally, he faced opponents worthy of his attention. The Custodes radiated competence and dedication in ways that reminded him of his own divine servants from ages past. Their equipment was sophisticated beyond anything he had previously encountered in this galaxy, their spiritual resonance refined to a degree that suggested genuine understanding of divine hierarchy. "I come seeking audience with your Emperor," Zeus announced, his voice echoing through the vast corridors with perfect clarity. "I would speak with him as one deity to another, to understand the nature of his authority and the scope of his responsibility." Captain General Valoris stepped forward, his ancient features carved from stone and determination. "None may approach the Golden Throne without proper authorization. The Emperor's rest must not be disturbed by any threat, regardless of its claimed nature or supposed power." The response pleased Zeus more than any show of submission might have. Here was a servant who understood the proper relationship between divine authority and mortal duty. The Custodes were not merely soldiers but guardians in the truest sense, protectors whose loyalty transcended personal survival or tactical advantage. "Your devotion honors your master," Zeus acknowledged, lightning playing around his fingertips as divine power built toward some unknown crescendo. "But I am not a threat to be turned away by mortal guardians, however skilled. I am Zeus, King of Olympus, and I will have my audience." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a collision between competing concepts of divine authority. The Custodes attacked with weapons that channeled the Emperor's own psyche, their guardianic essence, spears striking with force that could cleave through the hull of a battleship. Zeus met their assault not but with demonstration with violence, showing through deed rather than destruction the fundamental difference between their respective natures. Where the Custodes' weapons struck, they found not flesh that could be wounded but authority that could not be challenged. Zeus did not defend himself so much as he simply remained, his existence too fundamental to be threatened by any mortal agency. The Golden Warriors found their perfect techniques rendered meaningless, their blessed weapons unable to harm something that existed on a plane beyond physical interaction. Yet Zeus made no move to strike back. These guardians served their master with honor, and honor deserved recognition even when it was misguided. Instead of violence, he offered revelation, allowing each Custodes to experience for a brief moment the true scope of divine authority as it had existed before their emperor's rise to power. The effect was transformative. Warriors who had known absolute certainty in their purpose suddenly found themselves confronted with evidence that their understanding of divinity was incomplete. The emperor was powerful, perhaps more powerful than any single being they had previously encountered, but he was not unique. He was not the sole deity in a universe of mortals, but rather one god among others in a cosmos far stranger and more complex than imperial doctrine had ever suggested. Captain General Valoris felt his worldview shifting as divine revelation pressed against his consciousness. For 3,000 years, he had served the emperor with unwavering faith, never questioning the fundamental assumptions that guided imperial theology. But now those assumptions crumbled as he experienced firsthand the presence of another deity, one whose authority was neither derived from nor dependent upon the throne of terror. The realization should have been devastating, should have shattered his faith and left him broken and purposeless. Instead, Valoris found himself filled with a strange sense of wonder. The universe was larger and more mysterious than he had ever imagined, filled with forms of divinity that transcended his previous understanding. Rather than diminishing his emperor, this revelation seemed to place him in a broader context, one god among many in a cosmos that was vast enough to contain multiple the shift forms of divine authority. Zeus sensed in the Custodes' spiritual resonance and nodded approvingly. These warriors possessed their understanding, the wisdom to adapt when confronted with new evidence, a flexibility that spoke well of their fundamental character. They would serve any master with equal dedication, but they were capable of growth and learning in ways that made them valuable beyond mere military function. "Stand aside," Zeus commanded, and this time the words carried no compulsion, merely request backed by demonstrated authority. "I would speak with your emperor as one sovereign to another, to understand how this galaxy has come to its present condition and what might be done to improve it." Slowly, reluctantly, but with genuine respect for what they had witnessed, the Custodes lowered their weapons and stepped aside. The golden corridor stretched before Zeus, leading deeper into the heart of the imperial palace toward a confrontation that would reshape the fundamental nature of authority throughout the galaxy. Behind him, the 10,000 watched in stunned silence as their absolute certainties dissolved into something far more complex and potentially far more hopeful than anything they had previously dared to imagine. The corridors of the imperial palace stretched endlessly before Zeus, their golden walls inscribed with the deeds of heroes and the names of the fallen across 10,000 years of unending war. Each step the Olympian deity took sent ripples through the palace's ancient structure, not through physical force, but through the simple presence of authority that recognized no equals. The very stones seemed to whisper in languages that predated human civilization, responding to power that awakened memories locked in their crystalline matrix since the dark age of technology. As Zeus progressed deeper into the palace's heart, the effects of his passage became increasingly apparent throughout the Imperium. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, Cardinal Baphomet found himself unable to complete the evening benediction as visions of Mount Olympus intruded upon his prayers. The familiar litanies praising the emperor's singular divinity caught in his throat, replaced by half-remembered hymns to gods whose names had been forgotten for millennia. In the Segmentum Solar, entire fleets of imperial navy vessels experienced simultaneous failures of their navigation systems as the Astronomican's steady beacon wavered under influences it had never been designed to accommodate. Admiral Quarren, commanding the battle fleet Gothic from the bridge of his flagship Indomitable Truth, watched in growing alarm as his most experienced navigators reported impossible readings. The warp itself seemed to be restructuring around some new center of divine authority, creating eddies and currents that defied every principle of imperial navigation doctrine. The Adeptus Mechanicus faced perhaps the most profound crisis, as their most sacred cogitators began producing calculations that contradicted fundamental axioms of their faith. On Mars itself, the Fabricator General convened an emergency conclave as machine spirits throughout the Red Planet exhibited unprecedented behaviors. Ancient STCs that had remained dormant for millennia suddenly activated, producing blueprints for technologies that bore no resemblance to any known imperial design yet somehow felt familiar, as if they were memories of humanity's earliest achievements rather than alien innovations. Within the depths of the imperial palace, Zeus encountered increasingly sophisticated defenses as he approached the throne room. Automated weapon systems that had never fired in anger swiveled to track his movement, their targeting cogitators struggling to acquire locks on something that existed partially outside conventional space-time. Force fields that could withstand the impact of orbital bombardments flickered and failed as divine presence overloaded their generators through means their creators had never anticipated. The Silent Sisterhood materialized from hidden alcoves, their null presence creating pockets of psychic emptiness that should have disrupted any warp-based entity. Sister Superior Jefta Kirinov led her squad with the fluid precision of warriors trained to combat the most dangerous psychers in the galaxy. Their pariah genes, carefully cultivated across generations, made them living voids in the warp, immune to psychic influence and capable of disrupting supernatural phenomena through their mere presence. Zeus paused as the Sisters of Silence formed their battle line, intrigued by these mortals who somehow existed outside the normal flow of psychic energy. They were anomalies in their own right, humans who had been born without souls in the conventional sense, making them perfect weapons against entities that depended upon warp-based power for their existence. Yet as the Sisters activated their null field generators and advanced in perfect coordination, Zeus realized that their unique nature made them more vulnerable to his particular form of divinity, not less. Where warp-based entities drew their power from the immaterium and could be disrupted by psychic nullification, his authority derived from sources far more fundamental. He was not a creature of the warp, but a primordial force of nature given consciousness and will, as inevitable as gravity and as constant as the speed of light. The null fields that surrounded the Sisters of Silence simply passed through him like shadows attempting to block the Sunday. Their carefully maintained psychic emptiness, so effective against daemons and rogue psychers, had no more effect on Zeus than a vacuum would have on the fundamental forces that held atoms together. He was not supernatural in the sense they understood, but rather natural in ways that transcended their limited comprehension. Sister Superior Kirinov felt the failure of her null presence like a physical blow as Zeus approached without apparent concern for the psychic barriers that had protected her throughout centuries of service. Her enhanced physiology, modified to produce stronger null fields than even normal pariahs, seemed suddenly inadequate against something that existed outside all conventional categories of threat assessment. Zeus regarded the Silent Sisters with genuine curiosity rather than hostility. Their unique nature fascinated him in ways that ordinary mortals could not. They were proof that this reality contained wonders and variations that his own realm had never produced, evolutionary adaptations that spoke to the incredible diversity of human potential when properly guided. "You are guardians of silence," he observed, his voice somehow audible despite their null presence normally preventing psychic communication. "In my realm, such dedication would be honored among the servants of Hestia, goddess of the hearth and sacred mysteries. Your service to your emperor reflects well upon his ability to inspire loyalty." The acknowledgement of their worth, coming from an entity that had casually dismissed every other defense the palace could muster, struck the Sisters of Silence with unexpected force. They had spent their lives being feared and avoided, their pariah nature making them outcasts even among the emperor's most devoted servants. To be recognized and praised by a being of such obvious power created emotional responses they had been trained to suppress but could not entirely deny. Sister Superior Kirinov lowered her bolt pistol, not in but in recognition surrender that her weapons were irrelevant against this particular threat. Zeus had demonstrated that he could bypass their defenses without effort, yet he showed no hostility toward them personally. This was not the behavior of a daemon or chaos entity seeking to corrupt or destroy, but rather that of a ruler acknowledging the worth of honorable opponents. The king of Olympus continued his progress through the palace's innermost sanctums, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation that would reshape the fundamental nature of authority throughout the galaxy. Behind him, the defenders he had encountered remained at their posts, not defeated, but rather transformed by their exposure to forms of divinity they had never been taught to recognize or understand. In the approach to the throne room itself, Zeus encountered the ultimate expression of imperial defensive capability. The Legio Custodes had deployed their most ancient and powerful warriors, veterans whose service dated back to the unification wars on Terra itself. These were not merely the Emperor's bodyguards but his chosen companions, warriors who had fought beside him during humanity's first steps toward galactic dominion. Tribune Diocletian emerged from the golden shadows, his Terminator armor gleaming with honors earned across millennia of service. Behind him stood a full century of custodian guard, each warrior a legend in his own right, their guardian spears humming with energies drawn directly from the Emperor's own divine essence. These were the men who had stood watch over their master's body for 10,000 years, who had never wavered in their duty, despite the terrible knowledge of what that vigil truly cost. "I am Tribune Diocletian of the A Warrior," announced, his voice carrying the weight Adeptus Custodes, the ancient of centuries. "In the name of the Master of Mankind, I command you to halt. None may approach the Golden Throne without his express permission, and he has granted no such permission to you." Zeus studied these ultimate guardians with growing respect. Where the earlier defenders had been skilled but ultimately limited by their mortal nature, these custodians radiated competence that approached the divine. Their enhanced physiology, their perfect training, their absolute dedication combined to create warriors who transcended normal human limitations while remaining fundamentally mortal in their essential nature. "You serve your master with honor," Zeus acknowledged, lightning playing across his features as divine power responded to the proximity of another deity's chosen champions. "But I have not come as a supplicant seeking audience. I am Zeus, king of Olympus, and I will speak with this emperor as one sovereign to another." Tribune Diocletian raised his guardian spear, its blade crackling with energies that had been blessed by the emperor himself during the earliest days of the Imperium. Around him, his battle brothers fell into perfect formation, their movements coordinated through centuries of shared experience and mutual trust. These were not soldiers who followed orders, but brothers who anticipated each other's actions through bonds deeper than mere camaraderie. What followed was not a battle, but rather a demonstration of the fundamental differences between mortal excellence and divine authority. The custodians attacked with precision that bordered on the supernatural, their guardian spears weaving patterns of death that would have overwhelmed any conventional opponent. They moved as one organism, each warrior's actions perfectly complementing those of his brothers, creating a combat effectiveness that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. Zeus met their assault with something approaching admiration. These mortals fought with skill that would have impressed even Ares, the god of war himself. Their techniques were flawless, their dedication absolute, and their courage beyond question. In any conventional sense, they represented the pinnacle of martial achievement, the ultimate expression of what mortals could become when properly trained and equipped. Yet for all their excellence, they remained fundamentally mortal, and Zeus was fundamentally not. Where their weapons struck, they found not flesh that could be wounded, but authority that could not be challenged. The king of Olympus did not defend himself through superior technique or overwhelming force, but rather through the simple fact that his existence transcended the categories within which mortal combat operated. Tribune Diocletian felt his perfect strike pass through Zeus, as if the deity existed in a slightly different dimension, present enough to be seen and heard, but not solid enough to be harmed by conventional means. The realization struck him like a physical blow, not because it represented defeat, but because it revealed the limitations of his understanding. For 10,000 years, the custodians had prepared to face every conceivable threat to their emperor, but they had never imagined encountering another deity whose authority derived from sources entirely outside imperial theology. Zeus raised his hand, and the custodians found themselves unable to continue their attack. Not through any hostile force or mind control, but through the simple recognition that their weapons could not harm him, and that persistence would serve no purpose beyond the demonstration of futile dedication. Their enhanced intellects, capable of processing tactical information at superhuman speeds, reached the inevitable conclusion that conventional combat was meaningless against this particular opponent. "Stand aside, warriors," Zeus commanded, his tone carrying respect rather than contempt. "Your service honors your master, but this matter transcends mortal concerns. I would speak with the one you guard, not as enemy or supplicant, but as one deity acknowledging another." Tribune Diocletian struggled with the implications of this request. For 10 millennia, no one had been permitted to approach the Golden Throne without explicit authorization from the highest levels of imperial authority. The protocols governing access to the emperor's presence had been established during the darkest days of the Horus heresy and had never been modified or relaxed. To step aside now would represent a fundamental violation of everything the custodians stood for. Yet the evidence of his senses could not be denied. This Zeus possessed power that rivaled their emperor's own, authority that seemed to derive from sources as ancient and fundamental as those that sustained the master of mankind. If he truly was a deity rather than some form of powerful psyche or warp entity, then the normal protocols might not apply. The question was whether they could afford to make such a determination without guidance from higher authority. The answer came not through rational analysis, but through direct, divine intervention. From the throne room beyond, a presence made itself known that dwarfed even Zeus's impressive display of power. The Emperor of Mankind, silent for 10,000 years, spoke directly into the minds of his custodian guard, his psychic voice carrying absolute authority tempered by something that might have been curiosity. "Let him pass," the Emperor commanded, his mental voice reaching not only his guardians but Zeus himself. "I would indeed speak with this self-proclaimed king of Olympus. It has been long since I encountered another who claims divine authority with such conviction." The custodians stepped aside with obvious reluctance, their every instinct screaming against allowing an unknown entity access to their master. Yet they could no more disobey a direct command from the Emperor than they could cease breathing through conscious effort. Their loyalty was absolute, their trust complete, even when they could not understand the wisdom behind their orders. Zeus nodded acknowledgement to the custodians as he passed between their ranks, recognizing the magnitude of their sacrifice in setting aside their protective instincts. These warriors had devoted their entire existence to their emperor's protection, and stepping aside now must have cost them dearly in psychological terms. Their willingness to obey despite their reservations spoke well of both their discipline and their master's ability to inspire such devotion. The great doors of the throne room stood before him, massive portals of adamantium and blessed gold that had remained sealed for millennia. As Zeus approached, they swung open without visible mechanism, revealing the vast chamber beyond and the terrible majesty of what lay within. The golden throne rose before him like a mountain of technology and divine will, its impossible architecture defying every law of physics and aesthetics that Zeus had ever encountered. At its apex sat the Emperor of Mankind, his withered form sustained by machinery that hummed with energies drawn from sources both technological and mystical. The sight should have been pitiful, this desiccated remnant of what had once been a mighty warrior and leader. Instead, Zeus found himself facing a presence that rivaled his own in scope and authority, a being whose power had been refined and concentrated through 10,000 years of unimaginable sacrifice. This was not the broken remnant of a fallen god, but rather divinity transformed through suffering into something entirely new, a form of authority that Zeus had never encountered in his eons of existence. The Emperor's physical eyes had long since lost their sight, but the psychic gaze that turned toward Zeus carried the weight of galaxies. When he spoke, his voice echoed not through the air but directly into consciousness itself, bypassing all physical limitations through the application of will that had been honed across millennia of absolute rule. "So," the Emperor said, his mental voice carrying undertones of amusement that had been absent from imperial communications for generations, "another god walks among mortals. Tell me, Zeus of Olympus, what brings you to my realm in this age of ending times?" The question hung in the vast chamber like thunder before lightning, carrying implications that reached far beyond mere curiosity. Zeus studied the figure before him, taking in the terrible majesty of what the Emperor had become. Here was divinity refined through suffering into something unprecedented, authority purchased through sacrifice that would have broken lesser beings entirely. "I came seeking understanding," Zeus replied, his voice resonating through dimensions that normal acoustics could never reach. "In my realm, gods ruled through direct manifestation, through personal involvement in the struggles of mortals. Yet here I find a deity who governs through absence, who guides through withdrawal. Your methodology intrigues me." The Emperor's response carried the weight of eons, each word carefully measured against the accumulated wisdom of humanity's darkest age. "Understanding is a luxury I abandoned long ago, King of Olympus. What remains is necessity, duty, and the endless calculation of acceptable losses. You speak of direct rule as if it were a virtue, yet I observe that your realm no longer exists while mine endures." The observation struck Zeus with unexpected force. His Olympus, his pantheon, his entire reality had indeed fallen to whatever cosmic catastrophe had cast him into this strange universe. The Emperor's words carried no malice, merely the stark assessment of one survivor addressing another, but they highlighted a fundamental difference in their respective philosophies of divine rule. "Perhaps," Zeus conceded, lightning flickering around his form as divine emotions translated into elemental force. "But survival without purpose is merely prolonged death. Your people suffer endless war, live in ignorance and fear, die by the billions in conflicts they barely comprehend. What manner of protection is this? Is woe?" The golden throne pulsed with energy as the Emperor's attention focused more intently upon his visitor. Ancient machinery hummed with increased activity, channeling psychic force that made the air itself seem heavy with potential. When the Master of Mankind spoke again, his words carried the accumulated anguish of 10,000 years of impossible choices. "The protection of existence itself," the Emperor replied. "You judge my methods from the perspective of one who has never faced the true scope of the threats arrayed against humanity. Chaos is not merely opposition to be overcome through superior force, but entropy given consciousness, the fundamental breakdown of order made manifest. Against such enemies, conventional divine authority is not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive. Images flooded Zeus's consciousness, visions granted directly from the emperor's own memories. The Horus heresy unfolded in all its terrible detail, showing how even the most beloved and trusted champions could be turned against everything they had once sworn to protect. The birth of Slaanesh demonstrated how mortal excess could literally tear reality apart, creating predatory gods from the collective unconscious of entire species. The Long War revealed the relentless nature of chaos corruption, how it could turn humanity's greatest strengths into weaknesses that threatened the very survival of the species. Zeus absorbed these revelations with growing comprehension and mounting horror. In his own reality, divine conflicts had been matters of personal honor and territorial dispute, struggles between competing authorities that rarely threatened the fundamental structure of existence itself. But this universe operated according to far more dangerous principles, where the very act of worship could feed entities whose ultimate goal was the complete dissolution of ordered reality. "I begin to understand," Zeus admitted, his tone carrying new respect for the burdens his counterpart had chosen to bear. "Yet surely there must be some middle path between your distant guardianship and complete abandonment of divine responsibility. Your people hunger for meaning, for purpose beyond mere survival." Came the emperor's response, not in words but in direct psychic transmission, a flood of information that bypassed language entirely to convey concepts too complex for normal communication. Zeus experienced the full scope of imperial civilization as the master of mankind perceived it, seeing not just the suffering and oppression that had initially struck him, but the careful balance that kept humanity from complete extinction. Every cruel necessity had its purpose. The Ecclesiarchy's rigid doctrines prevented the formation of chaos cults by channeling human religious impulse into safe directions. The Inquisition's brutal methods eliminated threats before they could metastasize into existential dangers. The endless wars that consumed billions of lives also prevented stagnation that would invite corruption, keeping humanity's warrior spirit sharp enough to face threats that peace would have left them unprepared to handle. "You see it now," the emperor observed as Zeus processed this overwhelming revelation. "Every act of apparent cruelty serves the greater purpose of species survival. I am not beloved because love breeds complacency. I am not present because presence invites challenge from entities that feed upon divine conflict. I am not merciful because mercy in this universe is indistinguishable from suicide." Zeus found himself struggling with concepts that challenged every assumption he had ever held about the proper relationship between gods and mortals. In his realm, divine rule had been personal, immediate, and generally benevolent. Gods had walked among their worshippers, had involved themselves directly in mortal affairs, had sought to elevate and inspire rather than merely preserve. But this universe operated according to fundamentally different rules. Here, divine benevolence could literally become malevolent through the corrupting influence of chaos. Here, personal involvement invited challenges from entities whose very existence threatened the fabric of reality. Here, inspiration and elevation created vulnerabilities that hostile forces would inevitably exploit. Yet even within these constraints, Zeus argued, his divine intellect working to find solutions that might satisfy both necessity and virtue, surely there are opportunities for more direct guidance. Your people need not remain ignorant of the true threats they face. Knowledge breeds strength as surely as ignorance breeds vulnerability. The emperor's response carried undertones of bitter amusement, the laughter of one who had wrestled with identical questions for millennia without finding satisfactory answers. "Knowledge is the greatest danger of all, King of Olympus. Every human who learns the true nature of chaos becomes a potential vector for its influence. Every secret revealed creates a weakness that can be exploited. I have seen entire sectors fall because one scholar thought he could master forbidden lore, because one priest believed he could safely study the enemy. As if summoned by their conversation, the very forces they discussed made their presence known. Reality rippled around the throne room as entities from the warp pressed against the barriers that separated dimensions. The four great powers of chaos turned their attention toward this unprecedented gathering, sensing opportunity in the meeting of two divine authorities. Khorne's influence manifested first, a pressure of barely contained violence that sought to transform philosophical discussion into physical conflict. The blood god's essence whispered suggestions of combat, painting visions of Zeus and the Emperor locked in battle that would feed the skull throne for eons. Two such powerful beings destroying each other would provide a feast of violence that would strengthen chaos immeasurably. Tzeentch's touch followed, more subtle but equally dangerous. The changer of ways wove possibilities around the conversation, showing how knowledge shared between gods could be corrupted, how even benevolent intentions could be turned to serve chaos through careful manipulation. Every word spoken became a potential seed of future corruption, every revelation a weapon that could be used against humanity's defenders. Nurgle's presence brought with it the inevitability of decay, the gentle suggestion that all struggles were ultimately pointless because entropy would claim everything in the end. Why fight so hard to preserve what was doomed to fall? Why maintain such rigid control when acceptance would bring peace to countless suffering souls? Slaanesh added the final note to this symphony of temptation, offering perfection through excess, the promise that divine authority could be made more beautiful, more fulfilling, more complete, through just a small compromise, with forces that understood pleasure in ways that neither Zeus nor the Emperor had ever imagined. Both gods felt the pressure of these influences, the insidious way chaos sought to corrupt even their private conference. Zeus experienced for the first time the true nature of the threat the Emperor faced constantly, the relentless assault on consciousness itself that made every thought a potential battlefield. The Emperor responded to this intrusion with casual efficiency that spoke to 10,000 years of practice. Psychic barriers snapped into place around the throne room, not merely blocking the chaos influences but actively purging their taint from local reality. The Golden Throne's machinery hummed with increased activity as ancient systems designed for exactly this purpose engaged, creating a pocket of absolute purity in the heart of the Imperial Palace. "Now you understand," the Emperor said as the chaos presence retreated before his defenses. "This is not a single moment of temptation but a constant siege. Every second of every day, forces beyond mortal comprehension seek to corrupt, to subvert, to destroy everything we have built. Your direct approach to divinity would last perhaps minutes in this environment before being turned against the very people you sought to protect." Zeus absorbed this lesson with the wisdom of ages, recognizing truth when confronted with overwhelming evidence. His own divine nature, so perfectly suited to his original reality, would indeed become a liability in this universe of hostile influences. The Emperor's methods, harsh as they seemed, were adaptations to threats that required responses far beyond conventional divine authority. Yet, adaptation need not mean abandonment of all hope, Zeus observed, his tone carrying new understanding tempered by determination. If direct rule invites corruption, perhaps indirect guidance offers possibilities unexplored. If knowledge breeds vulnerability, perhaps wisdom shared carefully could strengthen rather than weaken. The Emperor's attention sharpened, focusing upon Zeus with an intensity that made the air itself seem to crystallize around them. For the first time in millennia, the master of mankind encountered another divine intelligence capable of meaningful contribution to the endless strategic calculations that governed his existence. Here was someone who might understand both the necessity of his methods and the possibility of refinement. "Speak plainly," the Emperor commanded. "What do you propose that 10,000 years of experience have not already considered and rejected?" Zeus gestured toward the vast chamber around them, his divine senses taking in the full scope of the Imperial Palace's psychic architecture. "You rule through symbols, through the faith of mortals who never see you directly. But symbols can be refined, faith can be focused more precisely. What if divinity could manifest not through personal presence, but through carefully chosen representatives? What if your authority could be expressed through champions who carried genuine divine blessing without themselves becoming targets for chaos corruption?" The concept struck the Emperor with the force of revelation. For 10 millennia, he had struggled with the fundamental contradiction of his position, the need to remain distant to avoid chaos attention while still providing guidance to humanity's defenders. Every attempt at direct intervention had created vulnerabilities that chaos had immediately sought to exploit. Every manifestation of his power had drawn responses that threatened to escalate beyond manageable proportions. But the idea of divine champions operating with genuine authority while remaining fundamentally mortal offered possibilities that conventional imperial doctrine had never explored. Such beings would possess the flexibility and presence that direct divine rule could provide, while maintaining the protective distance that chaos corruption required. "The concept has merit," the Emperor admitted, his mental voice carrying undertones of calculation as vast intellect worked through implications and possibilities. But the implementation would require precision beyond anything previously attempted. Too much authority would create new chaos targets. Too little would render the effort meaningless. Zeus nodded, understanding the delicate balance such an approach would require. "In my realm, heroes often carried divine blessing without themselves becoming gods. They acted as conduits for divine will while remaining fundamentally mortal in nature. The key was careful selection and precise limitation of the authority granted." The conversation that followed transformed from philosophical discussion to practical planning as two divine intellects worked together to address problems that had seemed intractable when faced alone. The Emperor's vast experience with chaos corruption, combined with Zeus's understanding of indirect divine influence, began to produce concepts that neither could have developed individually. Hours passed unnoticed as gods planned the future of humanity with the careful precision of master strategists. Outside the throne room, the effects of their collaboration began to ripple outward through imperial space in ways both subtle and profound, as the very nature of divine authority in the galaxy prepared to undergo its first fundamental change in 10,000 years. The implications of their discussion would soon reach far beyond the Golden Throne, touching every aspect of imperial civilization and challenging assumptions that had guided humanity through its darkest age. But for now, two gods worked together in unprecedented cooperation, united in their determination to find solutions that would preserve what was best about humanity while adapting to threats that neither had originally been designed to face. Their divine collaboration sent tremors through the fabric of reality itself as two cosmic intellects worked to reshape the fundamental nature of authority across the galaxy. The Golden Throne's ancient machinery hummed with frequencies that had not been heard since the dark age of technology, responding to psychic harmonics created by the unprecedented meeting of divine minds. Zeus found himself increasingly impressed by the Emperor's strategic acumen, the way 10 millennia of constant warfare had refined divine wisdom into something approaching perfect tactical calculation. Every suggestion the Olympian deity offered was immediately analyzed through the lens of countless past failures, each possibility measured against the accumulated experience of humanity's bloodiest age. The selection process would be critical, the Emperor continued, his mental voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Champions, chosen purely for martial prowess, would inevitably fall to the corruption same that claimed my sons. Those selected for moral purity would lack the flexibility necessary to make the harsh choices this galaxy demands. We require individuals who possess both strength and wisdom, yet remain humble enough to accept divine guidance without seeking to replace it. Zeus nodded, his divine intellect working through the complex requirements such champions would need to fulfill. In his original realm, heroes had emerged naturally from the intersection of divine blessing and mortal excellence. But this universe's hostile environment would require far more careful cultivation, more precise preparation than had ever been necessary before. Perhaps the answer lies not in selecting existing individuals, Zeus suggested, but in creating the conditions that would naturally produce such champions. Divine influence applied gradually, over generations, shaping bloodlines and cultures until they naturally give rise to the type of leaders humanity requires. The concept resonated through the Emperor's consciousness like a bell struck in perfect harmony. For millennia, he had struggled with the binary choice between direct intervention and complete withdrawal. But this approach offered a third path, one that could provide guidance while maintaining the protective distance that chaos corruption required. As their discussion deepened, both gods became aware of another presence stirring within the depths of the imperial palace. Something ancient and terrible was awakening, drawn by the unprecedented convergence of divine authority. The very stones of the palace began to whisper in languages that predated human civilization, responding to forces that had slept since the emperor's first ascension to the Golden Throne. Deep beneath the throne room, in chambers that existed only in the space between dimensions, the Star Child began to manifest. This fragment of the Emperor's original humanity, cast off during his transformation into the Master of Mankind, had slumbered for 10,000 years in the liminal spaces between reality and dream. But the presence of another deity, the possibility of change and growth that Zeus represented, stirred this dormant aspect to wakefulness. The Emperor felt this stirring like a physical pain, a reminder of what he had sacrificed in his transformation from mortal champion to cosmic guardian. The Star Child represented everything he had been forced to abandon: compassion without calculation, hope without reservation, love without the terrible knowledge of what love could become when corrupted by chaos. Zeus sensed the disturbance as well, his divine perception recognizing the psychic turbulence created by the Star Child's awakening. Here was something unprecedented in his experience, a fragment of divinity that had been deliberately severed from its source, yet continued to exist as an independent entity. The implications were staggering, suggesting possibilities for divine evolution that he had never imagined. "What is this presence?" Zeus asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than alarm. "I sense divinity, but fractured, incomplete. As if a god had been broken apart, and the pieces scattered across different planes of existence." And so Zeus learned the ultimate truth of this grim galaxy, that even gods must sacrifice their humanity to protect it. The king of Olympus had arrived expecting to find a usurper, but instead discovered a kindred spirit broken by necessity, a deity who had chosen eternal torment over the extinction of his people. In the darkness of the 41st millennium, divine authority meant not the glory of Mount Olympus, but the endless vigil of the Golden Throne. Perhaps that was the greatest tragedy of all.